When William Hayes became Charleston's most trusted funeral director, grieving families relied on him to honor their loved ones with dignity. But when his gambling debts and insurance fraud spiraled into murder, he began killing clients to steal their jewelry and organs, turning funeral homes into harvesting operations for the dead and dying. Before starting the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to the video. The humid Charleston morning cast long shadows across Magnolia Memorial Gardens as William Hayes arranged flowers and prepared viewing rooms for what would become the most dangerous funeral service of his 24-year career as South Carolina's most respected funeral director and mortuary specialist. At 51 years old, William had established himself as the Low Country's premier funeral professional, specializing in elaborate memorial services and cemetery arrangements that attracted prominent families, wealthy retirees, and grieving survivors who valued his compassionate demeanor and his expertise in providing dignified final farewells for their deceased loved ones. William's funeral home occupied a stately antebellum mansion in Charleston's historic district, featuring ornate viewing parlors, a full-service chapel, and state-of-the-art embalming facilities where he prepared bodies for burial while maintaining the highest standards of professional care and family privacy. His clientele included old Charleston families whose funeral traditions dated back generations, wealthy transplants seeking elegant memorial services, and prominent business leaders whose final arrangements required absolute discretion and flawless execution of complex ceremonial requirements. The interior of William's establishment reflected his commitment to funeral excellence and his understanding of grieving families' needs for both comfort and dignity during their most difficult moments, featuring antique furniture, stained glass windows, and carefully designed spaces that provided privacy for viewing and mourning while accommodating large gatherings for memorial services. His walls displayed certificates from mortuary science programs, testimonials from grateful families, and photographs documenting his participation in high-profile funeral services for prominent community members and visiting dignitaries. But beneath William's reputation for compassionate funeral care lay a dangerous combination of compulsive gambling, systematic fraud, and calculated murder that had transformed his funeral home into a criminal enterprise where vulnerable clients and suspicious investigators met their death through poisoning and organ harvesting operations. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," said Eleanor Morrison, her 9 o'clock appointment, and a 78-year-old widow whose recent terminal cancer diagnosis had prompted her to make advance funeral arrangements for herself, while also planning memorial services for her recently deceased husband. Eleanor was worth approximately $12 million from her family's shipping business and had specifically chosen William because of his reputation for handling high-profile funeral arrangements and his ability to provide the elaborate memorial services that her prominent family expected. "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison," William replied with the professional compassion and funeral expertise that had made him legendary among Charleston's grieving families, who viewed him as both a mortician and spiritual guide, capable of providing comfort during loss while ensuring that final arrangements honored the deceased with appropriate dignity and ceremony. "I've prepared some beautiful memorial options that will celebrate your husband's life while providing you with the peace of mind that comes from knowing your own final arrangements reflect your family's values and social standing." Eleanor had become William's most dangerous client, not because of her demanding funeral requirements or her prominent social position, but because of her recent discovery of suspicious activities at the funeral home and her growing awareness of the organ harvesting and insurance fraud operations that William had been conducting while families mourned their deceased loved ones. What Eleanor didn't know was that William had been systematically murdering terminally ill clients and harvesting organs from corpses for over 4 years, using his mortuary expertise and access to vulnerable individuals to eliminate wealthy victims whose deaths would provide access to valuable biological materials and insurance payouts. William's transformation from respected funeral director to calculating killer had begun 6 years earlier, when his compulsive gambling addiction at riverboat casinos had escalated from weekend entertainment to daily high-stakes betting that consumed his funeral home's profits and forced him into desperate debt with organized crime figures who controlled Charleston's illegal gambling operations. His losses at poker games, horse racing, and sports betting had accumulated to over $800,000, with loan sharks demanding immediate payment and threatening to destroy his business and harm his family. Faced with impossible financial demands and credible threats of violence, William had begun using his funeral home as a front for organ harvesting operations that sold human tissue and organs to black market medical networks, while systematically defrauding insurance companies through fake death certificates and manipulated cause-of-death documentation that concealed evidence of his criminal activities. His criminal activities had escalated when several terminally ill clients had expressed suspicions about his unusual interest in their medical conditions and had threatened to report their concerns to medical authorities and law enforcement agencies. William had murdered his first victim, a wealthy cancer patient who had discovered evidence of organ trafficking, by accelerating her death through lethal injection of potassium chloride during what appeared to be a compassionate end-of-life consultation. The success of his first murder had convinced William that eliminating suspicious clients and harvesting valuable biological materials was both necessary for protecting his criminal operations and extremely profitable when combined with systematic insurance fraud and estate manipulation. Over the following 4 years, William had murdered 13 additional individuals using various methods that took advantage of his mortuary expertise, his access to controlled substances, and his victims' trust in his professional compassion and medical knowledge. His victims had been carefully selected based on their terminal diagnoses, their valuable organ donations, and their wealthy estates that could be manipulated through forged documents and fraudulent death certificates. His victims had included Dr. Robert Chen, a prominent surgeon who had discovered evidence of organ trafficking and whose morphine drip had been contaminated with concentrated fentanyl; Jennifer Martinez, a wealthy socialite whose advanced funeral arrangements had revealed her valuable jewelry collection that William planned to steal; and David Foster, a federal medical investigator who had been tracking illegal organ harvesting operations and whose death had been staged as complications from existing heart conditions. "Mr. Hayes, I need to discuss some serious concerns about suspicious death patterns and reports of organ trafficking connected to your funeral home operations," said Detective Maria Rodriguez of the Charleston Police Department's Medical Crimes Division, as she entered the funeral home carrying a warrant to inspect Williams' facilities and interview him about suspicious activities. Detective Rodriguez specialized in investigating medical fraud and had developed expertise in recognizing patterns of illegal organ harvesting and systematic murder that exploited funeral home operations and vulnerable dying patients. Detective Rodriguez's investigation represented an existential threat to Williams' criminal operation, as her law enforcement expertise and access to medical crime databases could expose the systematic organ harvesting and connect him to multiple suspicious deaths of terminally ill clients. "Of course, Detective Rodriguez," William replied, though he felt the familiar surge of anxiety and fury that accompanied any official scrutiny of his funeral operations by law enforcement officers who possessed the training and resources to detect evidence of organ trafficking and systematic murder disguised as natural deaths or compassionate end-of-life care. "The dignity and proper care of the deceased is always my highest priority, and I want to cooperate with any investigation that might help protect families and ensure that funeral practices meet all applicable medical and legal standards." Detective Rodriguez consulted detailed reports from medical examiners and organ procurement organizations that showed patterns of suspicious organ removals and death certificate irregularities that suggested systematic criminal activity rather than legitimate funeral services or natural medical deaths. "William, I've been investigating reports of illegal organ harvesting and suspicious deaths involving clients of your funeral home," Detective Rodriguez said with the investigative precision that had made her successful in solving complex medical crime cases. 13 individuals who were receiving your funeral consultation services have died under suspicious circumstances, with several showing evidence of unauthorized organ removal and altered cause-of-death documentation that suggests systematic harvesting operations disguised as legitimate funeral preparation. The detective's identification of the organ harvesting patterns and her recognition of the death certificate manipulations confirmed William's worst fears that his criminal activities had been analyzed and connected to his systematic elimination of terminally ill clients and vulnerable individuals seeking advanced funeral planning services. William's response was swift and deadly, as he realized that eliminating Detective Rodriguez was essential for protecting his criminal enterprise and preventing exposure of his systematic organ harvesting and murder operations. Detective Rodriguez, I think there may be some misunderstanding about standard embalming procedures and the natural organ deterioration that occurs during the dying process, especially with terminally ill patients who often have complex medical conditions, Williams said, while discreetly reaching for a syringe containing concentrated succinylcholine that he kept hidden in his embalming supplies for emergency elimination of law enforcement threats. Perhaps we could examine some specific cases in my preparation room where I can demonstrate the legitimate funeral procedures that might explain these apparent irregularities. Mortuary science involves complex processes that might appear suspicious to those unfamiliar with professional embalming and body preparation techniques. Detective Rodriguez agreed to examine William's funeral preparation procedures, not realizing that the funeral director was leading her to a soundproof embalming room where previous murders had been committed and where William planned to inject her with the succinylcholine that would cause fatal respiratory paralysis while appearing to be a heart attack brought on by the stress of investigating disturbing medical crimes. William's plan involved convincing Detective Rodriguez to examine specific embalming equipment while explaining funeral procedures, then using his syringe to inject the succinylcholine directly into her bloodstream, causing immediate paralysis and death that would be attributed to the emotional trauma of investigating organ trafficking rather than deliberate murder by a funeral director protecting his criminal operations. But William's carefully planned murder of the detective was about to be prevented by the unexpected arrival of federal agents who had been investigating organ trafficking networks and had identified connections to his funeral home operations. Special Agent Michael Torres of the FBI's Medical Crimes Division had been conducting a comprehensive investigation into illegal organ harvesting and trafficking operations that used legitimate funeral homes and medical facilities to procure human tissue and organs for black market sales. Agent Torres specialized in investigating organ trafficking networks and had developed expertise in tracking criminal organizations that exploited mortuary services and vulnerable patients to harvest valuable biological materials. The federal investigation had been initiated by reports from multiple medical organizations and transplant centers who had noticed unusual patterns of organ procurement and suspicious death documentation that suggested organized criminal networks were using funeral homes to harvest organs while eliminating potential witnesses to their operations. Agent Torres had been conducting surveillance of William's funeral home and had documented evidence of systematic organ harvesting, client elimination, and fraudulent death documentation that suggested his mortuary expertise was being used for organized criminal activity rather than legitimate funeral services. "William Hayes, I'm Special Agent Torres with the FBI," he announced as he entered the embalming room where William was preparing to murder Detective Rodriguez. "I have federal warrants for your arrest on charges of trafficking in human organs, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of first-degree murder related to your systematic exploitation of funeral home operations for organ harvesting and elimination of potential witnesses." William's reaction to the federal agent's intervention was a combination of mortuary professionalism and desperate attempts to maintain his funeral authority. As he realized that law enforcement agencies at multiple levels had been investigating his organ trafficking activities and had connected them to systematic client murders. His carefully maintained reputation as a compassionate funeral director had failed to protect him from comprehensive investigation by agencies with expertise in medical crimes and organ trafficking. Special Agent Torres, there must be some serious misunderstanding about legitimate funeral preparation procedures and the complex medical processes involved in preparing bodies for burial while respecting family wishes and religious requirements. Williams said frantically, while abandoning his plan to poison Detective Rodriguez and attempting to preserve some semblance of professional credibility despite the overwhelming evidence against his criminal activities. "I am a licensed funeral director with 24 years of experience providing dignified funeral services for Charleston's most prominent families. All of my mortuary practices comply with established medical and legal standards designed to honor the deceased while providing comfort to grieving families during their most difficult times." Detective Rodriguez looked absolutely shocked as she realized how close she had come to being murdered by the funeral director she had been investigating for medical crimes. Her organ trafficking investigation had not only exposed Williams' systematic harvesting and murder operation, but it also prevented her own death at the hands of a killer who had been using funeral services as cover for systematic elimination of terminally ill clients and law enforcement threats. The comprehensive investigation that followed Williams' arrest revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise and the sophisticated methods he had developed to exploit funeral operations for systematic organ harvesting and murder. Forensic analysis of Williams' funeral home revealed extensive evidence of his organ trafficking operations, including sophisticated surgical equipment for removing organs, refrigeration systems for preserving harvested tissues, and detailed records showing coordination between client deaths and organ sales to black market medical networks. His embalming rooms contained stockpiles of controlled substances, modified medical instruments, and detailed profiles of terminally ill clients who had been targeted for organ harvesting and murder. The investigation also uncovered Williams' connections to organized crime figures who had been purchasing harvested organs and had provided protection for his trafficking operations while using his funeral home to eliminate potential witnesses to their medical crimes. His criminal network included corrupt medical professionals who had facilitated organ sales and dishonest coroners who had falsified death certificates to conceal evidence of systematic harvesting. Most disturbing was the discovery of Williams' detailed knowledge of human anatomy and organ preservation, which he had used to develop increasingly sophisticated methods for harvesting valuable biological materials while eliminating evidence of his criminal activities through cremation and burial services that destroyed forensic evidence. William Hayes was ultimately convicted of 14 counts of first-degree murder, trafficking in human organs, systematic medical fraud, conspiracy to commit organized criminal enterprise activities, and numerous other charges related to his exploitation of funeral operations for organ harvesting and elimination of potential witnesses. The conviction sent unprecedented shockwaves throughout Charleston's funeral industry, prompting immediate reforms in mortuary licensing, organ procurement oversight, and family protection protocols designed to protect grieving families and vulnerable patients from exploitation by trusted funeral professionals. Several other funeral homes and mortuary services were investigated for similar criminal activities, resulting in enhanced oversight of funeral operations and new requirements for medical documentation and ongoing monitoring that made it more difficult for criminals to exploit funeral services for systematic organ trafficking and murder. Detective Rodriguez and Special Agent Torres received recognition for their collaborative investigation and became specialists in mortuary crime investigation, developing new techniques for identifying organ trafficking operations and protecting vulnerable clients from exploitation by criminal funeral professionals. Eleanor Morrison and other surviving clients required extensive medical evaluation and psychological counseling to overcome the trauma of learning that their trusted funeral director had been systematically harvesting organs and murdering terminally ill clients while exploiting their funeral planning services for organized criminal activities. The funeral industry implemented comprehensive new safety protocols designed to protect families from exploitation by unethical mortuary professionals. The case prompted comprehensive changes in funeral industry regulation, including mandatory background checks for all funeral directors, enhanced oversight of organ procurement procedures, real-time monitoring of death documentation, and new reporting procedures for suspicious mortuary activities involving client medical care or organ handling. Williams' conviction also led to increased cooperation between funeral industry organizations and law enforcement agencies investigating medical crimes, with new protocols designed to identify funeral homes that might be exploiting their mortuary operations for systematic organ trafficking while eliminating potential witnesses to their criminal activities. The funeral and broader medical industries implemented revolutionary new safety measures, including enhanced security protocols for organ procurement, comprehensive family protection programs, mandatory reporting of suspicious medical activities, and improved training for recognizing signs of organ trafficking and client endangerment in funeral settings. 5 years after William's conviction and life imprisonment, Charleston's funeral community continued to implement safeguards designed to protect grieving families from funeral directors who might abuse their positions of trust and medical authority for criminal purposes. The funeral director, who had promised to provide dignified final arrangements and comfort to grieving families, had instead used his mortuary expertise and position of trust to commit systematic organ harvesting and murder, while turning funeral homes into criminal enterprises that exploited the dead and dying for profit. However, his crimes had been thoroughly exposed, and his victims had found justice through the dedication of investigators who refused to accept suspicious deaths as mere medical complications. William Hayes's final service had been performed on his own freedom, as he faced life imprisonment without possibility of parole, proving that even funeral professionals who attempted to exploit their mortuary expertise for criminal gain could be identified, investigated, and brought to justice when dedicated law enforcement agencies worked together to protect innocent families from predatory funeral directors. The funeral director's final service had concluded with his permanent burial in the justice system, serving as a lasting reminder that those entrusted with honoring the dead must never abuse that sacred responsibility, and that mortuary professionals who would exploit grieving families and harvest from the deceased will ultimately face the full consequences of their betrayal of funeral traditions and human dignity. Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.